Chapter 8 is called A Scottish Manor House 60 Years Since, and it's only short. All that happens is that Edward arrives in the village of Tully Veolan, rides through the village and comes to the manor house. That's it. So this whole chapter is actually the final mile of his ride. But I like it. There's quite a bit of description here. I think Walter Scott really had something to say. And it's the sort of stuff that I wanted from the last one that didn't come. He found the village a bit of a shock. The houses seem miserable. He's used to English villages which are kind of cheerful and sort of healthy peasantry stuff. That's not what he's seeing here. He's seeing absolute hovels around him. The road is unpaved, the ground is not levelled. He's seeing no order in this place. It's just a bunch of little huts with a road going between. So one of the first things he's noticing is children lying in the road, almost in a primitive state of nakedness, sprawling as if to be crushed by the hoofs of the first passing horse. Everybody of working age in this village is out in the fields. The only people left are babies that aren't old enough to do anything yet, and elderly people who are looking after the babies. The grandparents, I suppose. And they don't seem to be looking after the babies very well. Obviously, they don't see much traffic on this road, so it's fairly safe. But when Edward comes up to them, every so often, an old woman will run out, grab the little kid that Edward's horse is about to step on, give it a whack around the ears and haul it inside, screaming. And Edward is particularly noticing this. And as well as that, there are dogs. There are a ton of wild dogs, and they just nip at the heels of the horse. They're yelping and fighting, and all is very depressing. This is not what he expected to find. Walter Scott says this dog problem is something that did happen at the time. There were these wild dogs everywhere. He said it's still an ongoing issue, but not to the extent that it was in 1745. As Edward's moving through, every so often he sees old men at the cottages as well. So we've got the old men and then the old women who are looking after the toddlers. He spots a couple of girls coming back with water, and being about the age of 18, he's particularly noticing these girls. They're very pretty, but they've got bare arms, a single petticoats, bare arms, legs and feet, uncovered head and braided hair. He does find that quite picturesque, but even Edward is noticing that they're not really dressed for the climate. They look cold and they all need a good wash. So on he goes. At the end of the village, he comes to a forest. This is the land of the Manor of Tully Veolan. That's where Bradwardine lives. And I thought this was particularly well described. So we've got an ancient manor house. It's got a wall around it. It's enclosed in some kind of wall. And around that wall there is a forest and general grounds. And then there's an outer wall. So in between the outer and inner wall, I have no idea how far that is, because that bit's not described, but it looks like it's maybe a couple of miles. And in the outer wall, he comes to the outer wall and there's a gate, and through the gate there's a road that's a straight road that goes right from the outer gate to the inner gate. And he goes through the outer gate, takes his horse down this road to the inner gate, and that's actually what the whole chapter is about. This walk down this road. It's so beautifully described. It's got giant trees on the side and their branches meet overhead. Although it's a road for carriages, there's obviously been no traffic on it. He's finding it very still, very tranquil, kind of magical. He dismounts from his horse and he just walks. He's got a groom with him, which nobody's thought to mention until now. He and his groom walk through quite silently. It evokes a fantastic atmosphere, and it's the first real sign of what Walter Scott can do when he writes. The avenue seemed very little trodden, and chiefly by foot passengers, so that being very broad and enjoying a constant shade, it was clothed with grass of a deep and rich verdure. He heads towards the lower gate. The solitude and repose of the whole scene seemed almost romantic, and Waverley, who had given his horse to his servant on entering the first gate, walked slowly down the avenue, enjoying the grateful and cooling shade and so much pleased with the placid ideas of rest and seclusion excited by this confined and quiet scene, that he forgot the misery and dirt of the hamlet he had left behind. There's a lot of detail. This nether portal, like the former, opened in front of a wall ornamented with some rude sculpture with battlements on the top, over which were seen, half hidden by the trees of the avenue, the high steep roofs and narrow gables of the mansion, with lines indented into steps and corners decorated with small turrets. Bradwardine has the bear as his emblem, motif, symbol, I'm not sure. And at the outer gates there are these stones sort of roughly in the shape of bears. They're apparently very ancient. As he goes in, he can see bears on the inside wall as well, just little statues. He's in the courtyard of the manor. There's a pigeon house in one corner. There is a fountain in another with another bear statue, and it looks like the water passes through the bear somehow. The house is sort of a ramshackle, added onto kind of structure, very ancient. It had been built at a period when castles were no longer necessary, and when the Scottish architects had not yet acquired the art of designing a domestic residence. Numberless windows, but very small. Stables on one side, but they've only got little slits for windows. And Edward's servant thinks they look more like a prison than a stables. All sorts of bears, small and large, demi or in full proportion, were carved over the windows, upon the ends of the gables, terminated the spouts, and supported the turrets with the ancient family motto, "Beware the bear," cut under each Hyperborean form. The court was spacious, well paved, and perfectly clean. Everything around appeared solitary, and would have been silent but for the continued plashing of the fountain. And the whole scene still maintained the monastic illusion which the fancy of Waverley had conjured up. He's very impressed. At the end of this chapter, he's standing in this courtyard and he still hasn't seen a single person. So I don't really know what else I can say about that. It's a nice bit of description, very little action. In some ways it feels like the true start of the story. All the rest was sort of preamble, but now we are really in the moment. And yeah, everything that happened before, we were involved in momentary scenes, but we always then skipped. And Scott came back and gave a little bit of description, whereas now, for the first time, we're really experiencing the moment with Edward. In some ways, this is a very grand entrance he's just come through. It's like this is the proper entry of the story. Scott actually calls that inner gate a portal, and I think that's what we're seeing here. It's like he's entered a portal, as if this was a portal story. He's left the real world behind, he's gone through the gates, and this secluded place could almost be another world. But I did enjoy it. Chapter 9. I'm going to do the introduction here in this recording, and I've recorded some details elsewhere that I will finish off with, I think. I found this chapter very hard to summarise. And I don't know what I thought of it. I feel like it was meant to be comedic, but I actually just found it confusing. In this chapter, Edward tries to find somebody at this manor house. Yes, I do think comedy was what Scott was going for, and maybe it was effective comedy for 1805, 1815, whenever it was. To me, it missed the mark. He went to the door of the manor house and it had some giant knocker. He knocked, and that doesn't really give justice to what he did, because we're talking an ancient manor house with some giant knocker. So the knock was loud enough to go right through the whole place, and he heard it echoing inside, and he knew that if there was anyone in there they would have heard, but they didn't, and nobody came. After a while he went to the side of the house. There was a gate that's sort of like the front is fenced off, and he went through a gate into like a side yard, which is a proper garden, a nicely landscaped garden from the sounds of it. But there were still no people, and the house must be on the side of a hill. Like it said before that when he went to the avenue, he went to the lower gate. So I think what we can assume is that this whole place is in a valley. he got to the village, because the village was at the start of the Highlands, and ever since he passed through the village and through the outer gates, he's been going down. So the avenue was sloping down a bit. He got to the inner gate, which is sort of at a lower level than the upper, although not much lower, I don't think. Through that, and it's a perfectly flat courtyard, but only because I presume it's actually been levelled there. So when he went into the side gate, it's a garden that's sort of terraced, and there are flights of stairs, and he goes down the stairs, and there's a brook, and anyway, it all sounds really grand. It's hard for me to figure out the size we're talking about, because Scott talks about the gardens and the flights of stairs. I can't work out, like, are we talking 30 metres or 300 metres? I don't know. He doesn't really give any idea of scale, and this is one thing that I'm not really sure how big it would have been. But land was valued differently back then. There was a lot of land, so I'm guessing we're closer to like a 300 metre side of the house than a 30 metre. That's my guess. So he goes right to the back of the house and still sees nobody, and he goes around to the back. When he gets to the back, he actually sees a couple of servants doing laundry. They're doing laundry by actually standing in the tub with their dresses pulled up high. They seem to be just sort of having fun, singing and stamping. But when they see him, they shriek and run away. Partly, I presume, because they were not dressed very decorously there. They had their dresses right up. He could see all of their bare legs. So they were a bit embarrassed, so they ran away. But they're the first people he's seen, but at least we know that people lived here. After which, another person turns up, comes up a path. So once again, in this backyard, there's an expanse of ground before him. Like, the house is at his back. He's looking further down into the backyard, and it goes down even more. And there are some more outbuildings and trees. I can't really get a feel for it beyond that. But there's a path, and a man comes up the path, and he's a very strange man. He's doing some kind of little dance. He's dressed oddly. I couldn't really get a feel for it. Scott describes it in such great detail. It's like he describes every movement of his arms, and he's like putting his arms up over his head and bending them down. And anyway, Edward kind of realises that this guy is a bit touched in the head. It turns out that that's the case. He's a very simple man. He can't really communicate properly. So Edward is trying to ask him where Bradwardine is, the man he's come to see. But this fellow isn't really capable of telling him anything. He's just mostly non-verbal. But he does say something, Edward thinks, about a butler. So Edward says, yes, the butler. And then the fellow runs off. Edward thinks that maybe he's going to the butler, so Edward follows him. I cannot imagine why he did this. Like, why if he's going to follow anybody, like, why not just go and knock on the door? Because he knows that those two girls are there, so why follow the man who can't tell him anything? Anyway, he does. He follows the man, and he comes to the butler. From then on, it's all very easy. It turns out the rest of the family are down the back in the forest doing some kind of clearing of trees, and that's why there's no one in the house. Normally there would be. So once he's met up with the butler, who is a bit embarrassed because Edward caught him like with his coat off and his shirt sleeves up doing gardening, which isn't his job at all. It's all fine. He meets the butler. He learns that the other fellow is a simple person, and eventually he meets the lord of the manor. And I'm just going to explain that now in that way. And even that sounds really convoluted, because I just felt, to me, this chapter didn't hang together very well. I don't know if it's because after the last one I just wanted more of the same, but I had trouble visualising this. There was too much detail and not enough feeling for me to really understand what was going on. So having summarised that briefly, I'm going to switch to my earlier recording for the rest of it and just explain what I thought. In chapter 9, Edward uses the massive knocker on the hall door The architrave of that door bears the date 1594, so this is 1745, so it's an old place. He can hear the knocking going through the whole place, echoing through it, but there's no answers. Heads down towards the back. Several flights of steps placed in its centre and at its extremities into what might be called the garden proper. There are huge grotesque figures of animals, with the favourite bear repeatedly introduced. And that's on the house as well. Like carved into the side of the house, there are images of bears, statues and things. 2 bare-legged damsels, each standing in a spacious tub, performing with their feet the office of a patent washing machine. So they're stamping on clothes to wash them. He scared them. They sprung off like deer in different directions. He sees someone else, and he goes off to meet him, but he's like dressed like a jester, and he is dancing in a strange way. He tries to talk to him. He follows him and comes to an old man working in a garden. God calls him a major domo, and I'm not really sure what that means, but it seems like he actually is like the butler of the household. He's like the head of the servants, and he's really embarrassed to be found here working in the garden without his coat. Not that Edward thinks anything of that. So he pops his coat on and finds out who Edward is and says, "Oh, you'll be most welcome." And right at the end of the chapter, he finally meets Mr. Bradwardine and Mr. Bradwardine's daughter Rose, who is described so completely that clearly she's going to be the love interest. And that's what happens in chapter 9. Chapter 10, which is the last one for this video, opens with a very long description of Rose Bradwardine, who apparently is a total hottie, the talk of the neighbourhood. She is a pretty girl of the Scotch cast of beauty, with a profusion of hair of paley gold and a skin like the snow of her own mountains in whiteness. And I don't know how he can have it 2 ways, but he says, but she's not pallid. Her complexion, though not florid, was so pure as to seem transparent, but not pallid. Her form, though under the common size, was remarkably elegant, and her motions light, easy, and unembarrassed. And she's 17 years old, the perfect age for our Edward. Then we get a long description of Mr. Bradwardine, who is... He trained as a lawyer, but then he couldn't get work as a lawyer because of his Jacobite tendencies, so he went into the military. And then, as it said in a previous chapter, he got arrested for being part of the rebellion. Since then, he's just lived very quietly here in his mansion. So it describes him as having the pedantry of the lawyer, the military pride of the soldier, and the prejudices of ancient birth and Jacobite politics, greatly strengthened by habits of solitary and secluded authority. So he is a baron in a barony, which gives him certain powers, such as he can imprison people and he can issue fines. Apparently he doesn't do this much. He has done it on the odd occasion. He imprisoned 2 poachers in his dungeon where they were almost eaten by rats, and he put an old woman in the pillory for calling him a fool, I gather. He's really happy to see Edward. He conducted his guest through several apartments into the great dining room, wainscoted with black oak and hung round with the pictures of his ancestry, where a table was set forth in form for 6 persons, and an old-fashioned buffet displayed all the ancient and massive plate of the Bradwardine family. There are other guests there. To wind up, chapter 10 is all about introducing the characters here at Bradwardine Manor. So we've got the Baron of Bradwardine. I said something about him earlier, like who he was, what his history was, but there's a physical description here as well. He was tall, thin, and athletic, old indeed and grey-haired, but with every muscle rendered as tough as whipcord by constant exercise. He was dressed carelessly, more like a Frenchman than an Englishman, and from his hard features and perpendicular rigidity of stature, he bore some resemblance to a Swiss officer of the Guards. He looks very stern. That's not his personality, though. The man that Edward met first, the one who has an impaired intellect, his name is David Gallatley. unless it's David Gellatley. I'm actually not sure. I can't find anything online that talks about that pronunciation, so I'm going to call him Gellatley. The rest of this chapter is a meal. The table was set for 6. It looks like the family only consists of the Baron and his daughter Rose. We have David Gellatley, who is the mentally impaired man in the jester suit, who seems to be sort of in the household. It's hard to tell what his role is. It's kind of like he's running tame there rather than he lives there. I'm not really sure though. So there's 6 people at the table. The Baron, his daughter Rose, Edward, and 3 guests. The 3 guests are a Mr. Falconer, a Mr. Bull's Egg, and a Mr. McWeeble. We don't really get to know them in this chapter. They arrive for the meal and they get introduced to Edward. So I assume it's just a huge coincidence that Edward has arrived on the same day as these guests who have come for dinner, because they seem to come, maybe they're neighbours, but seems like they don't come every night. We get a bit of all of their story here, but we get it as dialogue from the Baron, and honestly it's rambling and it's a bit hard to read. He tells us a bit about the history of those 3 guests, the history of their households, that is, kind of like when they settled in Scotland, which millennia. I exaggerate, but you know, only just. There's a lot that could be interesting later on, but at this point we just don't know who they are, so it's a bit early. You just get this sensation that they're in a very dark chamber. I mean, this is an old house with small windows, and here they are in a room wainscoted in black oak. It sounds very dark. It sounds medieval almost. It's quite a setting, I'll have to admit. So the Baron, who is really, really happy to see Edward, is sort of rabbiting on about his memories of Sir Everard and of Rachel. They all call her Mrs. Rachel. I probably should have explained that before. This is because she's an old lady. Once you get to be an old lady, you just call yourself Mrs. because she's too old to get married. That's how they deemed it. She's not going to get married now. So she's not going to be Mrs. anybody. She's just Mrs. Rachel. That's who she is. She's Mrs. by virtue of being old. He's talking about how Mrs. Rachel was so fair and beautiful in her young years, and he sends Rose off to fetch the wine. I don't know how that must be for her. Here she is sitting with all these older men and younger men. And then dinner was served and the chapter ends very, very abruptly.